Imagine being sealed inside a wall, the cold stone closing around you, the air thinning with every breath. No blade cuts you, no fire burns you, no executioner swings a sword. Instead, you are left to starve, suffocate, and vanish from the world, buried alive within the very walls of society. This was immurement, a punishment so cruel and so terrifying that even other brutal methods of the past pale beside it. And chillingly, it wasn't always the work of sadistic rulers or vengeful mobs. Sometimes it was done in the name of God. Immurement is one of those punishments that's so medieval, so dream-inducing, that it just shouldn't exist. And history has evidence aplenty throughout Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Sometimes it was bound up with religious practice, as punishment for sin, as a means of sealing off fallen women, or as a symbolic sacrifice to God. Immurement shows us the terrifying power religion could have when there was a combination of fear and superstition. Let us step back and ask ourselves, how could religious people who taught redemption and mercy condone such a lengthy and agonizing punishment? There are cases of immurement in the history of both Catholic and Orthodox churches. One of the oldest and most appalling contexts was monastic discipline. Monastic constitutions included some very severe penalties for a monk or nun who broke their vows. In extraordinary but well-documented cases, a nun who had been accused of sexual immorality or heresy could be immured in a small cell, usually with no more than a narrow slit, for the reception of food and making confession, and be allowed to starve to death. This was never officially permitted in church law, but local abbots and bishops would overlook it from time to time. The reasons were gruesome. If the nun had violated her vow before God, then the only available punishment was eternal burial. Instead of being sent out into the world, she was walled up in stone as an example to the rest and a purification thought. Of all such instances, the most well-known is that in the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe. Balkan annals record women suspected of witchcraft or adultery being buried alive in niches in the walls of monasteries and then bricked up. It was not punishment, it was symbolic, though Professor Lieberthal does not explain what it symbolized. The sinner was made part of the holy foundation itself, walled quite literally into the house of God. Of course, not all immurement was for life. Some monastic orders had cells known as anchor holds, in which hermits or mystics voluntarily walled themselves away from the world for life. There is a crucial distinction, however. They chose to make their isolation an oblation of the spirit. Immurement as punishment provided them with no choice. In medieval Catholic Europe, immurement sometimes represented a grisly living death for guilty grave sinners. We know it was used for suspected adulteresses, heretics, even child murderers. Public executions, purging society, failed to deliver this second message. Immurement proclaimed the sinner was very literally walled off from the world, cut off from God's earthly community. One of the most notorious examples is the phenomenon of walls of penitence in certain regions of late medieval France and Italy. Women who had broken their vows or shamed their families could be walled up in small cells off churches. The little rooms, not much more than a coffin, had no door. There was only one slit in the wall where a priest would receive communion and hear confession, until that also was sealed with bricks. The religious rationale was dark but tempered. If a sinner could not be trusted in the flesh, she would be walled up alive in the walls of God, left to die in prayer, all earthly connections withheld. To certain priests, it was not cruelty, but God's justice. To the victims, it was unimaginable terror. Outside of Christian churches, immurement appeared in popular religion as a sacrificial ritual. In Eastern Europe, especially Romania and the Balkans, there are stories about masons immuring living individuals into bridge, castle, or church foundations. The best known is the Meșterul Manol ballad, about a master builder who was commanded by a heavenly voice to say that his church would be firm if he sacrificed his wife by walling her into the foundation. Historians wonder if that myth is merely correlated with practice or a symbolic account. But archaeological discoveries in some places tell us it wasn't always myth. The idea was that the victim's immured soul would guard the building, rendering it strong and secure. In this case, humans integrated human suffering into the very foundations of society. What's so disturbing is the way religion, superstition, and architecture became one practice, literally placing human suffering within buildings' walls. Immurement was not used in Islamic law as a sanctioned penalty under Sharia, but there are some chronicle reports of political rulers or religious leaders imposing it on women who had been accused of dishonor. In parts of the Ottoman Balkans, for instance, chronicles describe women being walled up for adultery on occasion, at the behest of local communities who desired a moral solution. In this case, the act was less legalistic and more religiously symbolic. To be sealed alive was to be shut off from forgiveness and the society of the faithful. It reflected the same fear in Christian Europe, that there were sins that infected society so deeply they could be purified only by utter exclusion. The most diabolical aspect of immurement is not so much the physical suffering, but the horror, the spiritual unleashed. Imagine being a devout believer in the 14th century and suddenly being told by priests or elders that you were to be immured. The message wasn't just that you would die, it was that you were to be buried alive because your soul had betrayed them. As opposed to the quick death, immurement entombed you in living through your own funeral. Walls shut in around you, light was quenched, and you wondered whether your prayers would ever ascend to the heavens. It was a macabre show to the general public, the sinner annihilated before their eyes, their cries stilled in stone. The twist, not justice, but control. Here is the ugly truth. Although immurement was framed as religious penance, in most cases it was a question of control, of sex, of women, of descent. Adulterers or heretics hauled before a tribunal were very frequently handy scapegoats. Families and institutions used immurement not merely to chastise but to quiet. Walled up and muted, she was not able to give her side of the story, never. So, immurement wasn't merely barbaric, it was political. Religion offered the sacred imperative, but power was typically behind it, silenced, imprisoned, and their shame never troubles the community again. Now, immurement appalls us because it turned faith upside down. Religions that taught salvation and forgiveness at times became tools of repression and oblivion. And the act itself, the wall, the stone, the darkness, has a symbolism that continues to haunt us. We no longer wall people into walls, yet the phenomenon of being walled off, silenced, and cancelled from society remains. From immurement in solitary confinement to how societies avoid those whom they fear, immurement's echoes remain. That is quite possibly the most frightening legacy of all. Immurement reminds us that cruelty usually comes veiled in righteousness. And once religion and fear become intertwined, the walls that are erected are not made of stone only, they're made of silence. If this story upset you, be consoled. It's just one page in the hundreds of years-long book of human punishment. What do you think? Was immurement worse than sword or fire? Tell us in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories of history's worst punishments, be sure to subscribe and tune in next time.